The morning light in Dallas crept slowly across the blinds, turning the pale hospital walls into strips of gray and gold. It was late January, a season when the air outside carried a brittle chill, and the oak trees stood bare against a sky the color of cold steel. Inside room 407, the hum of machines kept time like a metronome, steady, patient, unwilling to let silence have the last word. Robert Harris lay propped against the pillows, his chest bound with bandages that pulled each time he shifted. He was 68 years old, though in that moment he felt older than every mile he had driven, every shift he had worked, every night he had stayed late at the plant to make sure bills were paid. A man who had always been strong enough to carry others now needed help to sip water from a paper cup. He closed his eyes and let the coolness slide down his throat, and when he opened them again, the light had moved another inch across the wall. Dr. Emily Carter entered with her gentle but purposeful stride, the kind of walk that told patients she had seen both miracles and tragedies, but carried hope in her pocket anyway. She was young enough to still believe in second chances, old enough to know they did not come often. She greeted him softly, checked the monitors, tested his grip, asked him his name, the date, the city. Robert answered, his voice thin but steady, and she nodded as if each correct word was another stone in the foundation of his recovery. "You were gone for 47 seconds, she said quietly, not to frighten him, but to remind him how close life had slipped from his hands. But your heart found its rhythm again. We gave it a path to follow. Now it is your turn to walk that path slowly." Robert listened. He had spent a lifetime giving orders, signing checks, fixing what was broken. It felt strange to be told to take small steps, to measure progress not in paychecks or overtime hours, but in how far he could walk down a hallway without losing his breath. Yet in her voice, he heard something he could not ignore. Possibility. When she left, the room swelled with quiet. The television on the wall played a muted talk show, the hosts laughing soundlessly. Outside the window, the skyline of Dallas rose against the gray sky, towers of glass that looked cold from a distance. Robert reached for his phone on the tray beside the bed. The screen lit his face with its artificial glow. He scrolled, searching for something familiar, something warm. News alerts, pharmacy reminders, a coupon for tires. Nothing from Linda, his wife of over 40 years. Nothing from Michael, his only son, once the boy who had clung to his hand at Little League games. The silence from them pressed harder against his chest than any scar. A nurse entered then, Jennifer Collins, carrying a tray of medications. She was brisk but kind, the kind of nurse who made even the smallest task feel significant. She adjusted his blanket, asked about his pain, encouraged him to sit up for a few minutes. "Recovery is not a race," she told him. "It is a conversation between your body and your will." Robert thanked her. Gratitude had always come easily to him, though lately he realized it had rarely been returned. When she left, he stared again at the phone. He typed and erased, then typed again. At last, he settled on the simplest truth. "The hospital plans to release me today. Could someone pick me up?" He read it twice before pressing send, his thumb heavy against the glass. The minutes stretched. He counted his breaths, watched the thin clouds drag themselves across the Dallas sky. A nurse's laughter floated from the hallway, warm and human. Then his phone buzzed. It was Michael. The words were short. "Call a taxi. I am watching television." Robert stared at the screen, blinking, as if repetition might change the meaning. But the words stayed the same. A hollow ache spread inside his chest, deeper than stitches, sharper than painkillers could dull. Another buzz. Linda this time. "Stay in the hospital for another month. It is so nice without you." The room seemed to tilt. He placed the phone down carefully, almost tenderly, as if it were fragile porcelain. He looked around at the beeping machines, the folded gown on the chair, the discharge papers resting in their neat folder. He thought of the motorcycle he had once polished every Sunday before selling it for a crib. He thought of the trip to Paris he and Linda had once planned, but had quietly folded into the drawer when tuition bills came. He thought of every overtime hour, every missed fishing trip, every weekend sacrificed so that his family could live more easily. And now, when he had needed them most, their absence had spoken louder than any words of love they had ever said. Dr. Carter returned later to check his numbers one last time. She offered encouragement, reminded him of medications, told him to ask for help when he needed it. Nurse Collins followed with a cup of water and a kind smile. These strangers, bound to him by duty, had given him more comfort in 2 days than his own family had given in decades. Robert lifted the folder of discharge instructions. The paper was smooth beneath his hand, not heavy at all, yet he felt the weight of a decision pressing down on him. The paper spoke of healing, of time, of careful steps. But in his heart he knew they meant something else. They were not just a return to a house in Arlington. They were freedom from illusions, an invitation to reclaim dignity. As the orderly arrived with the wheelchair to take him downstairs, Robert pressed the folder close to his chest. He was leaving with more than bandages and instructions. He was leaving with clarity. And for the first time in years, the quiet inside him did not feel like defeat. It felt like the opening lines of a new chapter. The taxi ride from Baylor Hospital to Arlington stretched longer than the 20 miles marked on the meter. Robert Harris sat in the back seat, the folder of discharge papers balanced on his knees like a weight that had nothing to do with its thin stack of paper. Outside the window, Dallas passed in layers, downtown towers of glass and steel, neighborhoods lined with gas stations and fast food signs. Then the spread of quiet suburban streets where the lawns were clipped close to the ground even in winter. The driver hummed along with the radio, a country song about second chances and lost time. Robert listened without comment, staring at the world moving by. He thought about second chances. He thought about lost time. He thought about the fact that sometimes they were the same thing. When the cab pulled up to his house, the place looked exactly as it had before his heart failed. White siding, green shutters, a small tree standing guard by the walkway. But as Robert stepped inside, guided carefully by the driver's steady hand, the air inside told a different story. Shoes scattered at the door, empty cartons on the counter, the smell of grease clinging to the couch cushions. The recliner where he used to rest after long shifts was shoved aside, replaced by video game equipment. His study, once his sanctuary filled with books, his father's old desk, and a small globe he had promised to spin when retirement came, was now a storage closet of half-used exercise machines and laundry baskets. Robert moved slowly from room to room, each corner carrying the echo of choices he had made for others. He saw the kitchen table where he had once brought home extra paychecks to spread before Linda, her face lighting up at the relief of bills paid. He saw the hallway where Michael's drawings had once hung with crooked tape, now bare except for smudges where frames had been removed. The weight of years pressed down. He lowered himself into a chair and closed his eyes. Memory rose uninvited. He was 25 again, working double shifts, his hands raw from the factory floor, but smiling because Linda had called to tell him she was pregnant. He was 32, selling the motorcycle he loved because Michael needed braces. He was 45, canceling the trip to Paris they had dreamed of because tuition bills had doubled that year. Again and again, he had given without question. And now, when his own body had failed, their words on his phone had confirmed what he had tried so long to ignore. The silence in the house was not peaceful. It was empty. He stood and walked into the study. Dust coated the old safe in the corner. He knelt carefully, wincing at the pull in his chest, and turned the dial with practiced hands. The click of the lock opening sounded louder than it should have in the quiet room. Inside lay his will, folded neatly in a blue folder. He pulled it out, set it on the desk, and read, "To my beloved wife, to my dear son." Once those words had felt like truth. Now they felt like fiction. He sat for a long while, the will before him, the discharge instructions beside it. One spoke of healing wounds, the other of leaving behind all he had worked for. And in that moment, Robert saw with clarity that healing and leaving were bound together. The next morning, dressed carefully in a shirt and jacket, he drove downtown. The city shimmered with the energy of weekday traffic, horns and buses, the shuffle of workers in suits carrying coffee. The law office was on the 15th floor, its lobby lined with framed photographs of Dallas landmarks. Jonathan Miller greeted him with a handshake, firm but not forceful, the kind of handshake that made a man feel seen. Jonathan had represented families for 30 years and had learned when to speak and when to listen. Today, he listened. Robert told him about the surgery, about the silence from his wife and son, about the messages that had cut deeper than any scalpel. His voice did not tremble. He spoke as a man tired of illusions. Jonathan asked the question that mattered. "Mr. Harris, are you acting from anger?" "No," Robert replied. "I am acting from clarity." They spoke of options. Robert wanted his estate to go where it could save lives, not be wasted by those who saw it as entitlement. The American Heart Association came quickly to mind. Robert knew their work, knew they funded the very research that had helped the surgeons at Baylor bring him back. Together they drafted a plan. Robert would retain the right to live in his house. A modest income would support him through his later years. Upon his passing, the assets would flow directly to the foundation, untouched by family hands that had already proven careless. When the documents were ready, Robert took the pen. His signature was not a flourish, but a steady line. Each stroke was both a severing and a reclaiming. He signed page after page, and with each one, he felt lighter. Jonathan gathered the copies into a folder. "Mr. Harris," he said, "you may have done more than secure your own peace today. You may have given a gift that will outlast you." As Robert left the office, the winter sun glared against the skyscrapers. He paused on the sidewalk, folder tucked under his arm, and breathed deeply. The air stung, but it felt clean. That afternoon, he met with Rebecca Johnson at the American Heart Association. Her office walls were covered with posters of families, children holding balloons after surgery, grandparents walking in parks with grandchildren. She listened with intent as Robert told his story. He spoke of the nurses who had become his family, the wife who told him the house was better without him, the son who had chosen television over his father's life. He spoke of choosing dignity over resentment. Rebecca leaned forward. "We are organizing interviews for Heart Health Awareness Week. Your story could reach people who need to hear it. Would you be willing to speak on camera?" Robert thought of his quiet house, of the dust in his study, of the weightless feeling he carried since signing the papers. He thought of how many others might be sitting in hospital beds, waiting for a door that never opened. "Yes," he said at last, "I will speak, but I will speak the truth. Dignity deserves nothing less." Rebecca smiled, and the room seemed brighter for it. The morning of the interview began with a gray sky, the kind of low Texas clouds that seemed to press down on rooftops. Robert Harris rose earlier than usual, his body still stiff from surgery, his chest pulling with every stretch. He dressed carefully, clean shirt, pressed slacks, and the jacket he had once worn to church on Sundays. He stood for a long moment before the mirror, studying the face that looked back. It was a face lined with years of work, with scars deeper than the fresh one across his chest. Yet in his eyes there was something he had not seen in years. Steadiness. At 9 o'clock sharp, the Channel 8 van rolled up in front of his Arlington home. The neighborhood stirred with curiosity. Curtains twitched. Mrs. Henderson from across the street lingered on her porch, clutching her robe tighter against the cold. A cameraman, sound engineer, and reporter stepped out, their movements quick and practiced. Rebecca Johnson was already there, greeting them with professional ease, reminding Robert quietly, "You do not need to perform, just speak your truth." Inside, the crew set up lights that washed the living room in brightness. The hum of the camera filled the air as they adjusted angles. Robert sat in his recliner, his own chair, returned to its rightful place, while the reporter, a woman named Lisa Ramirez, took the seat across from him. She was in her 40s, composed, with a voice smooth enough to make viewers lean in without realizing it. She smiled warmly. "Mr. Harris," she began, "thank you for letting us into your home. Could you tell us, in your own words, what happened the night of your surgery?" Robert's hands rested on his knees. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant at first, but grew steady. He told of the pain in his chest, the rush of sirens, the cold hospital lights. He spoke of the surgeons and nurses who worked like angels with steady hands. He paused, then described waking in recovery, searching for familiar faces, waiting for a hand to hold. His gaze shifted, steady now, as he said, "But no one came." Lisa let the silence linger. The hum of the camera was the only sound. Robert did not cry, did not raise his voice. He spoke of scrolling through his phone, of the message from his son telling him to call a taxi, of the words from his wife saying the house was better without him. His tone carried no anger, only truth. "And what did you decide to do with that truth?" Lisa asked. Robert lifted the folder beside him, laying it on the table where the camera could see. "I decided to give what I worked for to those who saved me, not to those who left me." He spoke of the American Heart Association, of the research that had kept him alive, of the nurses who had become his family in his darkest hour. Lisa nodded, her expression soft. "And what do you hope people hear in your story?" "That love is measured not in promises or gifts," Robert said, his eyes meeting the camera's lens, "but in who shows up when you cannot stand on your own." When the interview ended, Rebecca squeezed his hand. "You did well," she whispered. Robert exhaled deeply, feeling both exhausted and lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from his chest that no surgery could have removed. That evening, the story aired. Across Dallas, televisions flickered with his image. Neighbors gathered around their screens. At the local diner, patrons leaned closer to listen, forks pausing mid-air. At a grocery checkout, the cashier whispered to the bag boy, "That's him. He lives just a few streets over." On social media, comments multiplied, some from strangers who thanked him for his courage, others who admitted they too had sat alone in hospital rooms, forgotten by those they loved. Phone calls began. Old friends from the plant left voicemails filled with respect. A pastor offered prayer. A woman Robert had not spoken to in 20 years wrote a letter saying she wished she had been half as brave. But not everyone watched with admiration. In the same living room where Robert's absence had once gone unnoticed, Linda sat frozen, the television's glow sharp against her face. Michael shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight, his eyes refusing to meet hers. For the first time, they saw the man they had dismissed stand taller than either of them imagined. His calm truth had reached farther than their excuses ever could. 3 days later, Robert found a letter slid under his front door. No return address, only hurried handwriting across the page. "We need to talk. You went too far." He read it twice, the uneven strokes trembling across the paper. He set it on the table beside the folder of legal documents, poured himself a glass of water, and stared at the closed door. The house was silent, but it was no longer empty. The world had heard his truth, and now he waited to learn who would come knocking, and with what intentions. The knock came just after sunrise, when the neighborhood was still rubbing sleep from its eyes, and the street looked washed clean by the pale light of a Texas winter morning. Robert Harris had been standing at the kitchen counter, warming his hands around a mug of coffee and listening to the slow rhythm of the drip machine. The house felt new in its quiet, as if breathing in a different way, now that it no longer had to hold anyone else up. He set the mug down and walked to the door, his steps measured, the pull across his chest a reminder to move with care. Linda stood on the porch with her coat clutched tight, chin lifted like someone preparing for a cold wind. Michael stood half a step behind her, his shoulders squared too broadly, a posture that tried to look like strength and landed somewhere closer to stubbornness. For a long second, they only looked at one another. Behind them, the street held the small noises of morning, a dog collar jingling, a car starting, the rustle of a newspaper tossed onto a driveway. He opened the door wider and stepped aside. They entered without speaking, as if habit were a key they did not realize had already stopped fitting the lock. The living room showed the work he had done in the last day. He had cleared the surfaces and set the recliner where it belonged, angled toward the window instead of the glare of a screen. The tray table held a small stack of papers and a pen laid neatly beside them. Sunlight spread across the floorboards, making the dust motes look like a slow fall of snow. Linda sat on the edge of the couch and smoothed her skirt, the gesture automatic, the fingers restless. Michael stayed on his feet, leaning against the wall as if he could hold himself up by force. No one reached for an embrace. No one asked about stitches or sleep. "We need to talk," Linda said at last. Her voice carried a shake she tried to hide. "This thing on the news. The neighbors have been whispering. The church ladies called me. I went to the grocery store yesterday and everyone stared. You made us look like we threw you away. That is not fair." Robert rested one hand on the back of a chair and let the words settle. "I told the truth," he said. "I showed people what happened." "You know it was a joke," Michael cut in, jaw tight. "You were not alone. You had nurses, you had doctors. I told you to call a taxi because I was in the middle of a show. You could have waited an hour." Robert turned his head toward him. There was no anger in his face, only the steadiness that comes after a decision has been made and remade in the quiet of a long night. "I was coming home after heart surgery," he said. "A son does not miss that because a program is on. A wife does not tell a husband to stay away because the house feels better without him." Linda's eyes flashed with hurt. "You are twisting what I said. You know I did not mean it that way. Things have been hard. I was overwhelmed. You are not the only one who has felt tired." "I believe you have been tired," Robert answered. "But I was dying. That is not the same kind of tired." She looked down at her hands. They were pretty hands even now, with nails she kept neat. He remembered those hands in a younger season, rolling out dough for pies, holding a small boy's shoulders when first grade felt too large. He had loved those hands. The memory rose and passed without bitterness. Michael pushed off the wall and started to pace. "So what now?" he said. "You cut us out of everything and play the hero on television. You think people will clap for you when you are gone and we are out on the street. You think that makes you noble." Robert reached for the small stack of papers on the tray table and lifted the top page. The legal language lay calm and final against the letterhead. "I changed my will," he said in a clear voice. "I left the house and the rest to the American Heart Association. I will live here as long as I live. After that, this place will help people breathe again. People who sit in waiting rooms and count minutes on beeping machines while the world keeps turning." "Over my dead body," Michael snapped. The words rang ugly and loud in the room. He heard them himself and looked away, suddenly ashamed. "This house is in my name," Robert said. "Every mortgage payment came from my work. Every repair, every roof nail, every air conditioner that kept you cool in August. I am not taking anything that was yours. I am placing what is mine where it will matter." Linda's breath came fast. 40 years, Robert," she whispered. 40 years of marriage. Please, you cannot erase all of that with a signature." "I am not erasing it," he said. "I am acknowledging what it was. A man can honor the good that used to be and still set down what has become a burden. The past is not a ticket to my future." He walked to the kitchen table and sat. From here he could see the backyard through the sliding glass door, winter grass pale and flat, the oak tree casting a thin shadow. He folded his hands, waiting. The silence that filled the room was different from the silences of the last few years. It did not carry fear. It carried edges. Michael moved toward the table, his voice dropping into the rhythm of bargaining that had worked too many times. "What if I get a job and pay rent?" he said. "I can help with bills. I can start pulling weight." Robert did not look away. "You are 35, he said. "You should have been paying rent to your own landlord years ago." "I will change," Michael said. "I can change. You will see." "I hope you do," Robert said. "But you will not practice change here." Linda tried a different door, the one labeled memory. She leaned forward, her eyes shiny. "We raised a son together," she said softly. "We went to Little League games. We made Christmas dinners with too many side dishes. We promised in front of God and everyone we would hold on to each other in sickness and in health." "I held on," Robert said. His tone stayed gentle, which made the words land harder. "I held on when your mother got sick, and I drove you to see her 3 times a week for a year. I held on when the business Michael started failed, and I worked overtime to pay off the loan. I held on when the roof leaked and when the transmission went out and when the dentist said braces would save his smile. When I was the one who needed holding, you let go." Linda opened her mouth and closed it again. For a heartbeat, her face emptied of pretense, and he saw a younger woman with a long road under her shoes. Something like regret crossed her features, quick and small. Then she drew her chin up again. He stood, palms on the table for balance, and the kitchen clock ticked in the background with an ordinary certainty that comforted him. When he spoke next, his voice carried that same certainty. "You have 24 hours to leave this house," he said. "Take what belongs to you. Do not take what belongs to me. There will be no screaming, no broken plates, no dramatics. You will pack, and you will go, and you will begin the life that is actually yours." Linda pressed a hand to her chest, as if the words had pushed her backward. Michael made a sound, half laugh and half disbelief. "You cannot be serious," he said. "You will not do this. You will not call the police on your own family." "I hope I will not have to," Robert said, "but I will if you force me." Michael took a step closer, not menacing, just lost. "Where are we supposed to go?" he said. "We do not have savings. We do not have anything ready." "You have time," Robert said. 24 hours is more time than I had when a doctor told me my heart had stopped. You will use it better than I used my decades." Something in the room shifted then, some thread of control that had always run from Robert to the 2 people standing in front of him. It reversed direction, came back to his hands, and settled there as if it had been homeless and had finally found its address again. From the window he saw Mrs. Henderson across the street step onto her porch with a bag of birdseed. She looked over, hesitated, then offered a small wave. He lifted his hand in return, grateful for a neighbor who had never asked for more than a hello. Linda rose from the couch and walked to the bookshelf, touching the frames that lined the top. Wedding day. A day at the beach. A boy with a gap-toothed smile holding a baseball glove. She picked up the wedding photo, looked at the young bride she had been, and set the frame down carefully. "It is not supposed to end like this," she said. "It does not have to," Robert answered. "An ending is only one side of a page. The other side can hold a beginning if you write it that way." He went to the entryway, lifted his coat from the hook, and slipped it on. The weight on his shoulders felt right. He reached for the front door and paused, turning back to look at them with a face that was not hard, only resolved. "I am going for a walk," he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not plead. He simply laid down a line he would not step back across. "When I come back from my walk, I expect to see packing boxes." The morning arrived soft and pale, a Texas winter day that felt like a held breath. Robert Harris stepped onto his front porch with a mug of black coffee and lowered himself into the old chair that creaked in a friendly way beneath his weight. Steam rose in the cool air. Across the street, a newspaper lay folded on a driveway, and a jay hopped along the curb as if the world had nothing heavy to carry. From inside his house came the first sounds of movement. Cupboard doors opened. A drawer slid hard against its track. Tape peeled from a roll and snapped shut over cardboard. The house had a new language now. It spoke in the rustle of packing paper and the thump of full boxes set down with more force than care. He watched through the front window as Linda moved from room to room like a person in a dream that would not end. Her hair, usually arranged like a promise to herself, had flattened into a hurried twist. She lifted a stack of framed photographs and stood still as if each picture weighed more than its glass. Then she set them down, Not in a box, not back on the shelf, but on the floor beside her feet. In the hallway, Michael dragged a duffel bag that was older than either of them wanted to admit. He shoved clothes into it without folding, then went back for more, moving with a pace that tried to imitate purpose, but could not quite outrun panic. Neighbors began to notice. A dog walker slowed at the sight of cardboard on the porch. A jogger glanced twice, his breath clouding in the air. At last, the woman who had waved from her garden for 20 years crossed her lawn, hesitated at the edge of the Harris walkway, and lifted a hand in greeting. Her name was Evelyn Henderson, though most people called her by the title that marked a lifetime. Robert set his mug down and stood long enough to meet her halfway. "Everything all right today, Robert?" He nodded once, not in dismissal, but with the simple truth he had come to value. "Just some family changes, Evelyn. We will be fine." She searched his face for a longer answer, then read what she needed in his eyes and offered the gift of restraint. "If you need anything, I am right there." She glanced toward her house and back again. "And tonight I'm making a pot of chili. There will be extra." "Thank you, Evelyn. You are kind." She returned to her yard. Robert sat again and lifted the mug. He did not feel triumph. He felt a quiet that had edges. It was the kind of quiet a craftsman hears when a piece finally fits as it should. Inside, the rhythm of packing grew louder. Mid-morning, Linda stepped onto the porch. She held herself like a woman walking a tightrope, arms folded, eyes hard with the effort of not falling. The winter light caught the small lines at the corners of her eyes, lines Robert knew well because he had watched them arrive one summer at a time. 40 years of marriage does not disappear, she said. You cannot erase it with one interview and a stack of papers. He looked at her, not past her and not through her. I am not erasing it. I am naming it. I am setting down what has grown too heavy for me to carry alone. Her chin lifted. The church called me. The ladies are whispering. The cashier at the market stared. You have made us into a story. No, I spoke my truth. What people do with it is up to them. She opened her mouth, closed it, and tried again. We were scared, Robert. We did not know what to do when you were in the hospital. I said things I did not mean. He let the wind move between them, giving the moment air. Then he answered in the measured voice he had used for years when a machine at the plant needed tuning. Fear is real. So is neglect. The first can be confessed. The second has to be repaired. I am done doing that repair alone. She pressed her lips together and returned inside without a word. Robert watched her go and felt no sweetness in her retreat. There had been a time when he would have followed, fixing with his hands what could not be fixed with apology. That time had ended. Late morning, Michael came out with a box that was too heavy and set it down with a thud that made the porch boards complain. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and stared at his father like a man who had discovered a stranger living in the house he had always assumed would be his. I have applications in, he said. I can start paying rent here. I can handle the internet and the electric bill, and we can work out the rest as I get settled. We can make this fair. Robert kept his gaze steady. Fair would have started years ago. Responsibility is not a performance you put on when the audience shows up. It is a habit you build when no one is watching. Michael's jaw tightened. That is a nice line for television. It is a truth I learned the hard way. For a while there was only the scrape of cardboard against wood and the creak of hinges. At noon, Robert went inside to fix himself a sandwich. He sliced a tomato that tasted like winter and spread mustard across the bread with the slowness of a man who understands the worth of unremarkable tasks. At the sink, he rinsed the knife and dried it, set it in the drawer where it had always lived, and noticed that the simple act gave him a peace he had not felt in his own kitchen for years. Back on the porch, he ate while the day inched forward. The sun climbed, then began to lean toward afternoon. In the living room, Linda had opened a box of Christmas decorations. She held a small ornament made by a child's hand, a lopsided star shaped from schoolroom clay, and painted with a gold that had dulled. Her fingers trembled around it. For a heartbeat, her face softened into the tenderness Robert remembered from the little boy years. Then the mask of determination returned. She placed the star carefully into paper and lowered it into a box. As the hours wore on, Michael cycled through the old steps. Anger arrived first. "This is insane. You cannot survive without us." Robert did not answer that one. He let the claim fall between them and lie there, obvious and untrue. Bargaining followed. "I can put the car in my name. I will take care of the yard. I will handle repairs." "The yard has always been my pleasure," Robert said. "If I need help, I will hire a neighbor boy and pay him what the work is worth." Then came pleading, quieter and closer to the truth. "Where will we go? Mom has not worked in years. I do not have savings. We are not ready." "You will be," Robert said. "Readiness arrives when excuses run out of gas. It is not a comfort, but it is a beginning." By late afternoon, the rooms had changed shape. Spaces that had been crowded with things Robert did not choose stood open. Light fell differently across the floor, as if it had found places it had been unable to reach. He took out a broom and swept the entry hall without fuss, collecting the grit of movement into a small pile and carrying it to the trash. He wiped a coffee ring off a table and felt the small satisfaction of a circle disappearing under a cloth. Evelyn returned with a container wrapped in a towel to keep it warm. "Chilly," she said. "Cornbread is still cooling. Take your time and bring the dish back next week." He thanked her and reached for his wallet, not because she expected money, but because he had learned to honor labor. "Do not you even try," she said, recognizing the motion. "This is neighbor to neighbor. Just feed yourself tonight." He bowed his head a little. "Then I will do you the courtesy of accepting it well." The winter sky began to color. By 5:30, the car trunks stood open like mouths. Boxes were stacked and strapped. Grocery sacks that once carried groceries now carried toiletries and the loose pieces of a life that had never been taught to organize itself. Linda came to the porch one more time. At a loss for words, she smoothed her coat and let her eyes scan the home that had been hers by habit, if not by deed. She seemed to search every surface for a last-minute reprieve and found none. "I never thought it would come to this," she said. "Neither did I," Robert answered. "I thought that someday the gratitude would arrive that should have come long ago. I waited for it until my heart stopped. I am done waiting." At 6:00 the engines turned. Taillights glowed. The cars moved down the street and around the corner, past the oak tree that had held its leaves longer than seemed reasonable. The sound faded, and then there was only the soft hum of the heater in the hall and the steady beat behind Robert's ribs. He stood in the doorway and listened to his own house. The silence was real, but it was not empty. It had a tone to it, like the note a tuning fork gives when struck. He stepped through the rooms not as a victor, but as a man reacquainting himself with rooms he had once loved. He straightened a crooked frame. He opened windows to let the evening air sweep away the smell of tape and dust. In the study, he lifted a box of forgotten cables and carried it to the garage. Then he opened the desk drawer he had been afraid to open for years. Inside lay the travel brochures he had tucked away like postcards from a future he did not believe he would live to see. Big Bend, Zion, the Colorado Rockies, the Grand Canyon. He spread them on the desk, the paper cool under his fingers, colors bright against the deep wood. Each page showed a place that had waited patiently for him while he learned how to value himself. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove, then returned to the study and turned the small globe that had sat in the corner since Michael was a boy. The globe spun slowly, its continents moving under his fingertips like promises kept at last. From the kitchen came the faint rattle of a lid, the whisper of water beginning to think about a boil. He found a small notebook and a pen, pulled a chair to the desk, and began to write a simple list. March, Big Bend. May, Colorado. Autumn, Utah. He paused, listening to the quiet as if it might offer counsel, and added one more line. Winter, the sea. He stood and went to the kitchen, poured hot water over a tea bag, and brought the mug back to his desk. The steam rose like prayer. Outside, the last trace of daylight fled the sky and left the neighborhood to porch lights and the soft blue of televisions behind curtains. Robert did not turn on his television. He sat with his list, his tea, his brochures, and the steady company of a house that no longer asked him to be less than he was. He leaned back and let his hand rest on the cracked leather of the chair arm. The scar beneath his shirt itched in the way healing flesh does, and he welcomed the reminder. Healing is not the same as forgetting. Healing is remembering without surrender. Now it is my turn. The days that followed carried a rhythm Robert Harris had never known before. The house breathed differently without the constant shuffle of resentment moving through its halls. Morning light fell freely across the clean floorboards. The rooms echoed with the kind of silence that does not accuse but welcomes. Robert rose each day with a steadier chest and a sense of space inside him that had been absent for decades. On Monday, a letter arrived from the American Heart Association. He opened it at the kitchen table while steam curled from his mug of tea. Inside was a simple note of thanks, signed by Rebecca Johnson herself. She wrote of how his story had reached families across Dallas, how donations had already increased, how people who once felt invisible had written to say they felt seen. Robert ran a finger slowly over the words. He realized his life had not been narrowed by loss. It had widened into purpose. He began to walk in the mornings, a slow circle around the neighborhood that grew longer each day. Evelyn Henderson often waved from her yard, sometimes joining him for a block or two. They spoke of gardens, of birds, of small things that carry the weight of a day with grace. With each step, Robert's breath grew stronger, his legs more sure. He felt the stitch in his chest not as a wound, but as proof of survival. One afternoon, he sat on the porch with the brochures he had unearthed from his study drawer. The colors of canyons, rivers, and peaks glowed in the winter light. He turned them over, planning routes, noting seasons. He no longer dreamed of a Paris trip that had been sacrificed long ago. He dreamed of the land that had always been his to walk, waiting patiently for him to claim it. The phone rang less often than it once had, but when it did, the voices carried sincerity. Former coworkers invited him for coffee. A nurse from the hospital checked in just to say she remembered him. Even a stranger who had seen the interview wrote a letter, describing how Robert's courage had given him strength to face his own failing heart with dignity. These connections stitched something new in Robert, a fabric of community woven not from obligation, but from choice. One evening, as dusk spread purple across the Texas sky, Robert lit a lamp in the study and opened his notebook. On the first page, he had written his travel list. Tonight, he added a new line, "Speak when silence hurts others." He realized that his story was no longer about loss at all. It was about how a man once overlooked had become a voice for many. He set the pen down and leaned back, listening to the hum of the heater, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the faint song of wind against the eaves. For the first time in his 68 years, he felt not used, not dismissed, but whole. The world outside his window kept moving, cars on the highway, lights flicking on in kitchens, children calling to each other before supper. Robert smiled, a deep, unhurried smile. He knew tomorrow would arrive with its own demands, its own small tests of strength. But tonight, in the steady quiet of his home, he rested in the truth he had fought to claim. He had not only survived, he had reclaimed his life. There comes a time in every life when the noise of the world falls quiet, and what remains is the echo of the choices we have made. Robert's story has carried us through hospitals filled with fluorescent light, through a home heavy with neglect, through the steady hand of a lawyer, and into the bright lens of a camera that shared his truth with strangers. We have walked beside him as he faced the silence of abandonment, the sting of betrayal, and the weight of starting over. Yet what endures is not the sorrow of what was lost, but the quiet triumph of what was found. In the final chapter of his journey, Robert did not become a man of anger, nor did he choose bitterness. Instead, he discovered a dignity that had always been his, waiting only for him to claim it. The rooms of his house, once filled with voices that dismissed and diminished him, now held the sound of his own steady breathing. The neighbors who once passed with polite waves came to know him anew, not as a man left behind, but as a man who stood firm in truth. And across the city, strangers carried his story in their hearts, proof that even one calm voice can ripple outward and touch the lives of many. The lesson is as simple as it is profound. Hold fast to your dignity. Defend your truth with grace. Do not let the careless judgment of others define your worth. For when you stand with quiet strength, you do more than reclaim your own justice. You open a door for others to step through, to find hope, and to begin again. Life will always bring seasons when we are overlooked or underestimated. Yet, it is in those very seasons that the chance to rise reveals itself. Think for a moment about your own life. Perhaps you too have waited by a phone that did not ring, or sat by a door that never opened. Perhaps you have felt the sharp edge of being dismissed. Remember this: your value does not dim because others fail to see it. Like the lamp in a window glowing steadily against the night, even the smallest act of truth can guide someone, yourself included, through the darkest road. As this story settles in your memory, I invite you to pause. Ask yourself, where do I need to stand a little taller? Where have I mistaken silence for peace, when what was needed was courage? If Robert's journey has touched you, let it become more than a tale. Let it remind you that even in the later chapters of life, the page is never finished. And if this story has warmed something within you, consider passing that warmth to another, through kindness, through patience, through the simple gift of presence. For in the end, our legacy is not written in possessions or titles, but in the quiet light we leave glowing in the lives of others.